The debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye made one thing clear, and that is that people have different methods of reaching conclusions. And like Bill Nye, humanists value investigation and scientific methods that test claims based on evidence. Since humanists value investigation and scientific methods, many of us are familiar with the basics of evolution. However, explaining evolution can be kind of tricky. Evolving Misconceptions is a talk about how to present ourselves in explaining the theory of evolution and how to arm ourselves against mistakes. Now, Evolving Misconceptions will be presented by James Stewart, who's an associate professor of anthropology at Columbus State Community College, and also a former board member of the Humanist community of Central Ohio. So let's give a warm welcome and welcome back to James Stewart.
I have to say I wasn't bored at all, because I happened to overhear a conversation about, I think it was about misogynistic horses, or a misogynist with a deep voice. I didn't quite catch the overall theme, because I was just eavesdropping. But it sounded really neat. Something that showed up on the Mimi sites. Let me get started here. See, I told you it would take very long. All right. Well, I had no idea what the audience was going to be like here, let alone that there would be famous people and people who know much more about debating this than I. But I do teach this to undergrads, and there's a lot of misconceptions among undergrads, both the pro and con types. So I thought at Derek's suggestion, talk about a few of them. This just came up last night when I was writing the sheet that I passed out. Here's the biggest misconception that shows up all the time. This is like, these folks, IO9 is well, started off as a science fiction fandom site, but now it's science fiction and science-y stuff that overlaps with science fiction and the word, it's got the D word, and the D word here isn't Darwin. Design flaws. That's one of the big things. Just a quick history, just for those of you who might be not have read about the history of Darwin in a long time. The last word was the first word, in a way. First edition of Origin of Species, first time we used the word evolution, or a derivative of it, was the very last word, which is the very famous. And notice it's missing one of the quotes that goes in later on. Having been breathed life into the creator. The first edition was a little bit more secular there. So, because the word evolution is like theory. It means so many things to so many people, all depending on context. But when you're talking about science, you mean something pretty specific. And so I decided to, since I'm in academia, so I have access to Ohio Link, and it turns out the Oxford reference suite is available. I thought, well, let's go through some of the dictionaries of of evolution. Change with continuity of successive generations of organisms. Process by which new species are formed from pre-existing. Change with continuity. I'm seeing change here. Oh, cumulative change. See, the molecular biochemists and molecular biologists are there. And the physical and biological changes in the Dictionary of Genetics, organizational species. I like the definition, though, in the Oxford Dictionary of Sports, Science, and Medicine, which was none. So, and because I like playing with reference books, I thought, let's take a look at the OED, which is the last word, right, in English? So, at least they say they're a definitive word, and they've got the history to prove it. So I said, okay, let's find evolution. 16 entries, and if you take the printout, 12 pages. Oof. I mean, it's progression, opening out, unfolding, rolling. This is the kind of definitions that get rattled around in the back of our heads, in the back of the minds of folks who may not be as well informed by it. But even those of us who are informed about it, the metaphors we use often reflect these other types of definitions. When Darwin used it, it was more like this, which was the process by which living organisms or the parts develop from a rudimentary to a mature or complete state. But we find ourselves often talking about social evolution, which is a very different type of evolution. I mean, change in the ideas of a society. It's not the type of evolution. And popular culture, of course, reflects these. So, anybody know what this one is? Outer Limits episode called The Sixth Finger. This is the scientist who was the villain. Well, I guess he's kind of a villain, but he's a charismatic villain. He's tried to accelerate the gardener into the next stage of human evolution. And I guess we're getting an extra finger. Polydactyly becomes selected for in this environment. And of course, the most unfortunate design. And of course, this diagram here, which is not a scientific diagram, it's the march of progress, right? This idea of a linear pathway leading through all types of fossil forms and varied fossil forms, and then leading towards, which always used to be, the white guy at the end. Gould pointed that out. So this is author, or the person who made this one, I guess, was trying to address that. This idea of progress and progressivism is rattling around, and that's the people you're talking to about evolution. Having these kinds of definitions in their heads. Also, that evolution was a thing of the past. So some of the ideas I want to talk about somewhat quickly, because limited time, and I want to just talk about some buzz feeding stuff. The fish jumped right into the barrel for me last night. So change is still here. Our closest relative. You can't get there from here. Stop the evolution I want to get off. Applies to everything. Who's your daddy's? It's still going on even faster than ever. So, those of us with the science background know, as we start actually asking a question that we're going to try to answer through testing a hypothesis, we got to operationalize. What do our terms mean? Well, for biological evolution, the modern ideas in science unfold, get it, evolve from this core concept. Evolution is a change in the frequency of a genetic trait over time, at least in the Darwinian sense. Afterwards, we can talk about the epigenetics and non-genetic heritability, but that's something that just confuses the issue. Just a quick refresher. There's 4 forces of evolution, although some would throw in, like break up some of them into smaller pieces. But this is the core, mutation. And all the others random events affecting the course of evolution. Migration that brings back together separate gene pools. And natural selection, which is probably the one that most people tend to think of when they think of evolution, which is that competition, the struggle for existence. Those organisms that have a genetic trait that allows them to have more offspring win because they end up having more offspring, and their offspring has more offspring, that kind of thing. So, you are a mutant, every last one of you. No ifs, ands, or buts. You are mutants, and so is your mother, and so is your father. And so is your mother and father's mother and father. And so is, well, everything. Estimates vary. I mean, you got 3.5 billion ATGCs, step rungs in the DNA ladder. I've seen as low as 20, I've seen as high as 100. It's hard to really tell because how do you find one change in a billion or 3.5 billion? I mean, I'm not even quite sure our genome, how many genes are in the genome. I started grad school, it was 100,000. For a while it got whittled down to 30,000 and 24,000, and the most recent numbers I'm seeing is 19,000, which puts us really close to like, back to you. Okay, any case. And the other thing is, most mutations are deleterious. That's the idea that, I mean, even some of the textbooks say this. Well, if you have 3.5 billion ATGC matching, and only 1.5% of that is going to be turned into a protein, most mutations are neutral, absolutely neutral. And of course, what determines whether or not something is neutral is the environment. And the example I use in class, because I have to overstate a point to make a point, you know how that works. Like you have to use the metaphors of science to make the point, even though you're overstating, like every time you do Mendelian genetics. Let's say there's a gene for alcoholism. There is. Let's pretend. This is a thought experiment. So, is that gene good, bad, or neutral? Exactly. If you're in a place with no alcohol, it's pretty much neutral. Let's not get into diabetes and processing alcohol, healthy habits. I mean, it's pretty much neutral if there's no alcohol. If there's an environment where alcohol flows like a river, it could be very bad. If you look at animal studies, it's like they have roughly the same amount of alcoholism that humans do, given unlimited access to alcohol. One of the coolest things ever. Roughly the same frequency of teetotalers, of social drinkers, and the other thing you keep hearing, and the zoo, our local zoo is guilty of this, and a whole bunch of documentaries. And again, one of the classic mistakes that we see floating around that the folks you'll be talking to have is, well, who are our closest relatives? Well, I guess since the 70s, the bonobo has been the favored non-human primate for closest relative. Before that was the chimpanzee. But once the bonobos got to be studied in a lot more detail, and Franz de Waal published Chimpanzee Politics, in which you had a group of adolescents who were in the adolescent bonobos who were in the equivalent of a jail, really. And they were male and female mixed. Guess what the adolescents did a lot of? They made more. And but in the wild shows that there are a more peaceful group. To the best of my knowledge, now I read this a few years ago and I haven't followed it, but there's never been in the wild observed a bonobo killing another bonobo. Completely different from chimpanzees. And so those who study the history of science talk about how they are now used as metaphors for our two natures, the female-centric cooperative, and then the male-centered, violent, patriarchal, matriarchal. Getting, of course, that actually the bonobos are full of jerks. And they have fights too, and they don't have as much sex as they thought in the 70s.
Just like me.
And it gets harder, because what do you mean by our closest relative? This is a 2012 study comparing chimpanzees, humans, bonobos, B, C, H, and looking at different ways of measuring their divergence. And we have, depending on how you study it, you have different divergent points for lineages of genes. So here, we have a break here that goes like this, but if you look at this, the study found that the difference between humans and bonobos was 1.6, humans and chimpanzees is 1.7% of DNA. So out of 3.5 billion letters, 1.7% is what, 3,500? I'm not sure. Let's pretend. Spread across letters. But they have different breaking points, and even then, males and females contribute different amounts to the next generation. And chimpanzees and bonobos, the males have wildly different fertility, and they're also more related to one another, and it gets complicated. That's the problem with science. We just don't have like clear answers because of the way the method works, which is a lot of little truths. So, what percent of it? Well, we'll just say 2%, right? Oh, by the way, best of my knowledge, most recent numbers I've seen is 99.9%. That's how similar you are to the person sitting next to you. And a chimpanzee, if there were two chimpanzees, and there'd be about 99.6%. Wait, there's 4 times the genetic difference in chimpanzees than there are in humans, and there's 7 billion humans and a million chimpanzees. Well, the problem is, we like these nice family diagrams that have a linear, progressive approach. Evolution doesn't work with these type of branches because it's implying that there's a direction to it, that we are headed somewhere. This is a more stem and leaf diagram that shows that instead of thinking about things leading us, things are branching off wherever they're going. And I just found this the other day too. This is not a scientific diagram. This is. Scientific diagrams are information dense. This is an interesting picture. Hey, it's a nice picture. You got some kind of quadruped. I guess you might call it a chimp if you saw it today, but who knows what it is. And of course there's the old idea that's floating around that nothing could match the perfection of the human eye, which Darwin actually brings up and then says, I just can't imagine how we could have the human eye, and then he shows how it could happen right after that. A lot of our things just kind of happen. Filtrums, not that difficult, probably due to the way your maxilla grows, which just happens the same in all the mammals. All the famous ones. This groove here is not, to channel your snot away. It's not up eating your own snot. Rather, it's the way your skin gets laid down and the way the bones get laid together. Now, it could be a trait that undergoes evolution at some point, but it never evolved per se. It wasn't a subject to selection, probably. But if you can isolate the genes, you can go into it. And that's again Physics is wonderful for giving us models and metaphors. Kind of true. We can tell if a population is evolving. Right now, if I could do something called a Hardy-Weinberg, and I could tell if we were a breeding population, if we were evolving, just by looking at gene and allele frequencies of one genotype, is that gene evolving? I can't say where it's evolving to. Because there's no direction. The only direction is toward whatever has the most children. We can't say humans are getting bigger brains. We can't say humans are losing their fingers or their little toes, unless we notice that 8-toed people are having more children than 10-toed people. Then that is what you're talking about. These are the ideas that roll around in popular culture. It's all about competition, as the folks were talking about before. A lot of it's cooperation. How can you have a gene for homosexuality? Let's pretend that something as complex as this is genetic. It turns out, well, it makes you a great aunt or uncle. And that means all of a sudden, your relatives, the gene is increasing in frequency, especially if it's a dependent. Don't tell anybody, I can't think of the word for it. Density-dependent trait. So, looking at this thing, there's a missing slide here. Oh, that's really annoying. So let's jump to the evolving misconceptions. So, in a Darwinian sense, what is evolving? Notice I threw in the caveat there. Well, it's not you. It's not your family. It's the people in your society. And this is one of the hardest ideas I found that undergraduates have wrapping their brains around. Population thinking. Because evolution is a change in the frequency of a trait. Go back here. Let's bring up the slides again. Again, if I can remember what it looked like. Change in the frequency of a genetic trait over time. It has to be a genetic trait. So for evolution to occur, the trait in question has to be genetic. It has to be variable. The variation for that trait, it's not going to be. One more really confusing thing that's when I'm speaking of the Hardy-Weinberg idea. For the most part, each gene is evolving independently in this population. It goes back to Mendel's second law, which is almost true, kept true by a process called crossing over. Every gene is going off in its own direction. Every gene is evolving separately. So, in the last humanity has evolved. I suppose we are. Are there people who have mutations? Well, we were established all of you are mutants, right? Are random events removing genes from the gene pool, especially in small groups? Okay, we see that every day. Can we see once separate groups come together? According to 23andMe, I'm about 6% sub-Saharan African genetically. That's gene flow. Every day. Natural selection. Are some people having children, more children than others, or fewer children than others, because of genetic reasons? Well, there we go. There's evolution in daily life. The big-scale evolution, macroevolution, is this. Thank Lyell, I think, for Darwin's realization. This uniformitarian idea that small changes over long periods of time have enormous consequences. And this is a BuzzFeed article that came out after the debate. One of the debaters was named after one of the Noachians. Is that how you got his name? Yeah.
It sounds like it. Noah's Ham.
Yeah. Well, that BuzzFeed it's articles by photos, and so they just have like goofy photos of things. So they asked a bunch of creationists to say their ideas about evolution, because science by definition is a theory. We all know the difference, but it never hurts to say it again. Because theory and sciences are a lot of hypotheses that are interrelated and after extensive testing haven't shown to be wrong yet. Like atomic theory of matter, heliocentrism. We don't test theories in science. We test hypotheses, little explanations. So, let's say, big idea, sun's made of hydrogen. We can't fly to the sun and get a piece of it, right? Anything we fly up there will vaporize. So what do we do? And in science, what we do is we test the logical consequences of the idea. So the person who says, I'll believe it once I see every organism, every fossil, and every step, it doesn't work that way. It's like in crime. You find the circumstantial evidence. All evidence is circumstantial evidence. So what else would be true? If the sun's made of hydrogen, what would the solar wind be made of? What would the mass of the sun be? You can tell that by the way that the center of the solar system keeps spiraling around the sun, based on where the large planets are. The epicenter of the sun's moving, all planets moving. Spectral lines. And this came up in class, except the student who brought it up said, why are the chimpanzees still here? Of course. I think this is picky, but maybe I'm wrong. We didn't evolve from monkeys at all. In fact, 35 million years ago, the lineage leading to old world monkeys branched off from the lineage leading to apes, and it really wasn't a monkey in between. It was some kind of tarsier-like thing that we have no model of today. Apes are closest living relatives, share a common ancestor. This part we all know as, but we can say that we were an ape because apeness evolved before humans split up. Apeness begins about 22 million years ago. Lineage leading to humans. And so really the question is, it's like saying, if you and your cousin both are descended from your grandmother, why is your cousin still here? Because, again, it's that linear orthograde evolution that everything is building towards, well, what else? It's like ethnocentrism. We've got to be the pinnacle of evolution, but evolution isn't geared toward pinnacles or perfection. Everything's going off in its own direction. Sharks aren't evolving to become humans because there's no benefit for a shark. If only drown in the air. I just like this picture. God didn't create everything. How did the first single-celled organism originate? By chance. Yeah, okay. I mean, how did you originate? A few 100 million sperm? An egg? Which ones? What if your parents had a fight that night? You'd be your sibling. I mean, in the sense that, life unfolded. Got to keep the theme going. I won't bore you with the details here, but non-living things can reproduce. One of the characteristics of life in crystals grows, salt, it'll precipitate out. Some life, non-life, has a metabolism in a way, speaking metaphorically. Fire will take two things and create something else from it. The key idea here is they're looking for sudden switches like, let there be bacteria. You can't conceive of small parts coming together. It's like they've never seen a Lego kit. Now, of course, maybe they have. They said it has to be an intelligent designer. All the parts to life were there, assuming you're a fan of the RNA world hypothesis, which is my favorite right now. The nucleotides, RNA, amino acids, all of which are brought in by comets. And RNA is an interesting molecule. It can store information and act as an enzyme. So it's its own genetic code and actor. These two folks are saying pretty much the same thing. There's no in-between. The only one found has been Lucy, and there are hundreds. There are only a few pieces of the hundreds necessary for official proof. Now, what's official proof? That I've been trying to figure out. Is it like a court case? Does the judge decide? Why have we only found one Lucy? Well, it's a single individual. Well, okay, we've found more than one of everything else. I assume he's referring to living beings today. Well, that's just it. The scientists don't call this fossil Lucy. They call it AL288-1. Alpha locality, 288 find on that season. One individual. So when you're reading the professional literature, they don't say Lucy unless they're talking about like an exhibit or something like that. But generally, they'll say AL288-1. Fossils of specific individuals are referred to by their catalog or specimen number when the scientists are talking. And they'll use species designations, but those always change depending on how you draw the clumps and circles around. So Tong 1 is the first African fossil hominid, or hominid is I guess the popular term now. Tong baby. Kubi National Monument, West Lake Turkana, 17,000. But the black skull. STS5, Mrs. Plez. Because when it was first named, Robert Broom, who named it, gave it a different name, and it starts like Plesianthropus something.
What was Talon 1 renamed? Afarensis? It was originally Africanus.
Oh my God, you're right. It is Africanus. Don't tell anybody. I did the same thing with that with STS5. See, OH24 Homo habilis Twiggy. Why Twiggy? The skull was crushed post-mortem, and it was so narrow that it's like that mole, which also is cool because it tells you where they found it. Lucy's around 40% complete. Yeah, if you don't count the little bones in the wrist and the ankles, just count the bigger bones. Okay, sure. But Lucy isn't alone. They seem to be focused on the 1970s, Lucy, and I guess it's when the intellectuals of the movement, where they get their talking points from, that's when they went to school.
Yeah.
Seems reasonable to me. 15,000, not a boy, more complete. And caribou, which means surprise. Something like that. That was found just recently, and it's even more complete. So cowboy would have been, may have been 12 of our years, 8 of his years. What? The other thing is, things get tricky because different organisms have different rates of growth. So an 8-year-old Homo erectus or Homo ergaster, depending on which name he's using, would be equivalent to our 12-year-old because our lives have been getting longer for the last few million years by stretching out our childhood. Does not the second law, and I love the archaic phrase, phraseology. Thermodynamics disprove evolution. Okay, heat goes from warm to cold, so what? Oh, you mean the implications of the law. I mean, Darwin's energy, you can later reverse the process, can't you? Plants. Don't go to chaos. And my favorite one of them all. How can you explain a sunset if there is no God? That's my reaction. What? But it made me remember one of these, you know, Cosmos. The Cosmos generation. That's when I was in high school, starting college. Around the same time was Day the Universe Changed, which is the guy who does Connections, James Burke. Cool suits. Yeah. Cool leisure suits. But this, I think, summarizes a lot about the way science works, and it's one of the core ideas to get to. This is what Derek was talking about. Takes a few seconds. Come on, you can do it, James. Burke. Let me tell you, Joe.
What's going on behind me now? The door. And I saw the woman seeing. Was the sun going around the earth? What does every school kid know? The earth goes around the sun, and it doesn't take too many brains to understand that. So when Wittgenstein replied, yeah, but I wonder what it would have looked like if the sun had been going around the earth. On me, of course, it would look exactly the same.
That's where the whole science comes in. Let's test it. Okay, so it's logical, it's reasonable to believe the sun goes around the earth, but let's now test the idea. Let's test, wait, how can we can see the sun, and our eyes are deceiving us because, well, it turns out we see what we think we're seeing often. And our vision is informed by our past experience and the environment we grew up as an infant. So how do we test that? I don't know, how about looking in a well at noon at two different, what do you call those, longitudes? Like, what's his name? On Animax.
Aristarchus.
Aristarchus, thank you. Good. Excellent test. The sun was not directly overhead. The sun isn't directly overhead from here, right? I had a friend who is kind of depressed. She's from South Africa. She says, Christmas with snow? We have beach parties. All right, let's close it out with our closest relative. Well, it's obviously the monkeys. You know, because that's a band from the 60s. How close are we to that relative? 99.9% alike, although maybe not so much to Peter Tork. Okay, Darwinian evolution is no longer occurring. We established it is, right? We see it every day of our lives. Darwinian evolution is occurring, but slower than before. No. In fact, there's been more genetic changes over the last 10,000 years than there has been over the last 100,000 years. One reason, of course, is humans change the environment, and created a brand new one to evolve to. Global warming has contributed to the rise of genetically modified organisms which displaced the indigenous life forms 11,000 years ago. The invention of agriculture. Agriculture spread all over the world. New people with it. And it's starting to look as if that whenever agriculturists came across hunters and gatherers, a little bit of gene pool, a little bit of made, but not that much. It turns out we're all descended from the agriculturists. In most sense. They displaced them. And agriculturalists created a brand new world for humans. So when you hear about this paleo diet, well, our ancestors were the ones that chose to eat plants and get sick and die young. But had lots of kids. Which is why agriculture became the dominant form of surplus production. All right. I've run out of things to say. So, Ty, any questions or?
I'm just curious about how you handle the creationist response when you go through some of the things that you just did, showing what we would now call microevolution.
Yes.
And they say, "Oh, I accept all of that stuff, but it's still a dog. It's still an insect, and you can change it all you want, but that's just microevolution. What I'm talking about is you can't get a human from a monkey, or you can't get a mammal from a bacterium."
Yeah, I call that lecture Liger's Tigons. Oh my. There are Ligers. Actually, wonderful way science illustrates our patriarchal culture. Ligers, male lion, female tiger. Tigons, male tiger, female lion. They can hybridize. They can breed together. You only see this happen in zoos because in the wild, completely different environments. Wonderful example of speciation in progress. Horses and donkeys, for the most part, infertile. I think like one in every mule might be fertile enough to get the same chromosomal mutations in the line. Or not mutations, the same chromosomal rearrangements. Humans and chimps. Now, it looks as if maybe it's been tried, and nothing came of it. I was reading a recent review article. No, it wasn't an article, it was a chapter in the book that was describing some of the experiments that some of the dictatorial repressive regimes were trying, don't have the same protection from law, but also that it had volunteers. But also remember, the evolution class I teach, students are there to avoid taking biology. It's so they don't have to take a biology class and memorize as much about the cell. So they're more apathetic and okay, well, yeah, what's on the test? Only rarely does someone actually want to talk about it. And I just don't get it that much.
Something I've been curious about for a while. I don't really understand it. I'm just vaguely aware of criticism of natural selection by philosopher, cognitive scientist Jerry Fodor. And I don't know if you have if you're familiar with that or have a take on.
I wish I could. I bet you Frank can answer.
I
that.
don't know.
No, I don't know
I've
either.
heard of it.
See me, so I can look him up.
Okay.
After class. No,
Okay.
at the end, so I can look up the name.
Because he's definitely not a creationist or like an anti-science guy or anything like that.
Yeah. Holy cow! This natural selection really. It's a powerful explanation. I'd be curious to see what.
Do you have any idea of what his criticism amounts to at all, even roughly?
The only thing I can say is that it doesn't explain how genotype can give rise to phenotype.
Oh, well, there'd be an evo-devo kind of.
Oh, it's sort of developmental changes. I'd have to read it somehow.
I don't see how that
Maybe it's going on about something involving epigenetics and having methylation states of DNA,
Yeah,
which changes gene expression, but not the code.
Yeah, right.
And that might be. Oh, and the fact that stress causes bodies to grow differently. Maybe I could see a possible pathway, but I'll have to actually read what he says. So, like, if you were twins, and we let you be gestated in your mother had a twin sister, gestated in your mother with the same sperm. Go with me on this.
Okay.
And then you went to the sea level, and then the other one went to the Andes. You would come out different heights, different shapes. In fact, if you were born 150 years ago, you'd be about 2 inches shorter, all that kind of stuff, simply because of the environmental difference, no genetic change. But that's prehistory. Oh, speaking of the devil.
You did mention sexual selection, and I wonder if you encompass that under one of the other four forces. Darwin seemed to make a big deal of sexual selection.
To me, it just seems like natural selection. It's a struggle for it. If you just happen to have a big tail with lots of eye spots, the peahens seem to like you if you're a peacock.
But I guess the point being that the big tail would be actually against what natural selection.
Oh, I
would
see what
be
you're saying.
for.
Yes, I guess it's the example of the equivalent in humans is frat guys. You know, who do stupid things like surf the tops of cars, or smoke, or engage in ride motorcycles. Look at me. I can do all these dangerous things and still be alive. I've got to have some great genes. And it just causes all the ladies to start ovulating. That's the idea. You've got the burden, and the other genes must be compensating for that burden. Yeah, but Darwin, he said the sight of a peacock made him sick. And they think, well, I think everything made Darwin sick because he's sick all the time.
I think that the sexual selection, of course, one of the things that goes with that, of course, is chromosomal, because of sexual mixing, the chromosomal rearrangements and reassortments, which, in a way, I mean, speeds up selection compared to that in prokaryotes, which don't have sex as such. But I mean, that's not sexual selection specifically, but
Right.
it's related. So,
I had something, but it slipped away. Oh, sorry.
I wonder if a key thing you can discuss with your opponent is to bring up the idea of perfection of design. Just repeat the fact that the human body,
Oh yeah.
both men and women, are not. Maybe you can cite personal examples. You can go through a complete list of everything.
In fact, my slide had that.
Because I think there's this idea on the creationist side that because we were created by God, we are the perfect, the epiphany of everything. And that's also why there's this thought in evolution that we're proceeding towards a superior being. Yes.
Backbone. Sacrum, heard of maybe sacroiliac hurts? This is the sacrum, and it touches one of the big wing-shaped bones that's next to it. That's your iliac. Because you, instead of walking on all fours with long arms and distributing your weight on your knuckles and your shoulder blades, you're putting all of it right here, and this gives us back problems pretty much after we've had all of our kids. So it's not really subject to selection. This happens to be spondylolite feces, which is what I have. Oddly enough, that's why.
so do I.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's where like in my case, it's L5. One of your vertebrae, the bones that hold it in place are missing or broken, so it slides off the more you stand, and this ends up pulling that this and all the nerves with it as well. So, but this is, I mean, but you get other back problems as well. There's a classic article, which I don't know why it's not used more often, called, he talks about the spine as a suspension bridge. As an example of, quote, design flaws. Although, I guess the rational defender would say, although those are merely compromises. In other words, you have to go the pathway. You have to be a child before you can be an adult. You know, so like there's this torturous pathway. You have to go through school and have a lot of boring bad things happen before you develop into your maturity. But again, it's like children becoming adult. It's like some kind of orthograde maturation, which is so rooted in our culture and our beliefs and our brains that it's hard not to slip into that. So we sometimes even ask, well, why did this evolve? Nothing evolves for a reason. Mutations are a random process. It might increase the frequency for a reason. I'm not sure. How many kinds of flight evolved in the history of life on Earth? Okay, pterodactyls. The bipedal dinosaurs, or birds. Bats.
Insects?
And insects. Several times in insects.
What about flying squirrels?
Gliders. And same thing, flying lemurs. Can't fly, not a lemur. But how many times would flight have been really useful to avoid going extinct? There's so many compromises to fly that birds, once they give it up, they do. Which is another thing. If they stop using an organ, why does it go away? There's a benefit to that. Your body has a limited budget. Why do we waste growing Homo erectus-sized teeth, the most expensive tissue in our body? We can get by with growing much smaller teeth and putting that remaining energy into healing or having kids. So selection is weakened on keeping those traits. Same thing why those things that are in the caves go blind. There's no problem with not being able to see. So evolution, there's still natural selection going on. It's not like use and disuse like Lamarckian. It's selection is relaxed. On certain traits, you can redirect your energy budget.
I was just thinking of what Dan had mentioned, because after thinking about that a little bit more, I remember hearing something on some NPR podcast that was talking about that. And what I recall from it was the guy was saying, okay, yeah, sure, you get evolution of the genes, but that's not the end of the story as to whether or not it's going to actually produce protein. There's all this complicated process, like after the gene, to the production of a protein. And
so we say the gene-protein model is too simple to explain. Yeah.
No, well, what I'm remembering was not somebody who was critiquing evolution. They were saying that there's some more complicated pieces that need to be added in, but these were scientists talking about this stuff. And the only thing that, well, again, is talking about the expression of the protein. Obviously, it has to do with environment as well. And I can't remember what all they were saying, but at the end of the program, one of the other scientists was talking about, maybe I'm misremembering this, but it really stuck out in my mind, was the implication that things that you did in your life, in the environment basically, that you are in, which influences the expression of protein, can somehow be passed on.
It's epigenetics.
Yes.
The environment can change. What happens is often the environment can add, let's say, methyl groups to DNA, which makes the DNA molecule more sticky. And it's harder for DNA polymerase, or the DNA transcriptase, to get to it. And therefore it slows down the rate of that gene as being expressed. And this was done, that's actually found in rats and nurturing. Nurturing changes the expression of a particular gene, I forget which gene, and that changes the way the rats grow and develop mentally.
How's it get passed on?
That's just it. It happens to the mother while she's in her mother's womb. And that somehow, that mechanism is still not clear how these methyl groups that get stuck to the DNA get passed on to the children. It's not changing DNA sequence, but it's changing molecules that are attached to the DNA molecule. So you're passing on an environmental change. And it says Lamarck was right in a way.
It can be passed on in variable amounts. The methylation patterns and also the acetylation of the histones can be passed on for a number of generations. Typically, the amount will decline with each subsequent generation, and until finally, unless there's something to maintain this, it just disappears. But certainly, over a short period of time, several generations, these epigenetic changes can actually be inherited. There's now a project, I don't know if it's finished, on the methylome or whatever it's called.
Proteome to map these epigenetic changes. But rats, so the environment of the grandmother can affect the outcome of the grandchildren because of these epigenetic markers, which is changing the rate of expression of genes, not actually changing the sequence of the genes. There's some evidence now with the something called masturbatory functional hypothesis that our skulls are only so round because we don't chew heavy food as much anymore. I mean, our food is cooked and macerated and all this kind of stuff before we get to, and that might explain some of the accumulation of modern features in the last 100,000 years. Is all developmental, at least in the skulls. But that's a whole other topic.
Well, just one question. I know we have a lot of school teachers here, and I was just wondering, as a person who has some limited interaction with children through my niece and nephew, what would be the easiest way to explain proper evolution to younger children in a way that they can understand, but also is true to what evolution actually is, as opposed to the popular concept?
You know, I would ask a teacher who actually knows how to explain things to kids, because the only kids I see are the ones that get onto the school bus that are my neighbors. I mean, I got dogs, and I can explain things to my blue in the face, but some of them still pee on the floor. And don't get me started on the cats and my every time I want to make a tuna sandwich.
I found the children's section of the library has some excellent books that will help us with that. You help me understand it too.
Yeah.
It's rice for
I was going to say, if you could name what the biggest lack of understanding, biggest misconception that you see undergraduates coming in with, that they didn't learn properly in school.
Population. It's the population that evolves.
As
You
opposed to
are
the
not
individual.
evolving.
Okay.
So, if you, now, of course, I'm going to overstate it, but if you have a mutation, unless it's at a specific site in your body, it will not be passed on to your offspring. So if you get a mutation in the cells here, those aren't going to be passed. Typically, these mutations are more likely to occur when you are first growing and developing. It has to occur in a cell that becomes the stem cells for your gametes. See, science is so annoyingly precise that you can't actually. And this is actually why we as professors always have to answer a question with a question.
But you find students think they are personally
Yes,
evolving.
yes, yeah, and that the traits that they acquire. I mean, this Lamarckian,
Yeah.
the traits you acquire can be passed on to your kids, even though you tell them Lamarck is wrong. And they complain, why are you teaching us about Lamarck if Lamarck's wrong? Well, it's because it's wrong in such a logical reason.
Yeah.
It just sounds so good, but it's wrong.